Welcome to another episode of Strategic Thinking and Leading. My name is Timothy Williamson, and I am your host. Our vision is to find, guide, develop, and encourage deep, holistic, and creative strategic thinkers and leaders. First, though, a disclaimer. This is an unclassified discussion. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of any particular organization, ideology, or government. And we're honored to have with us today Dr. Edward Rockower. He's going to discuss thinking about thinking, as you can see on your screen.
So I called this updated and continued. I had gotten through some of the aspects that I thought were important, where you might have more formulaic types of ways of approaching thinking, where creativity was described and how that related to the unconscious mind, how solving physics problems when I was teaching in Okinawa, Japan, to U.S. military students, and how I elected to solve problems while standing up in front of the class, problems that I had not seen before, so that they could see how I thought about it and the various steps that I went through and how the problem seemed to always solve itself as long as I followed that set of procedures of transforming the problem. So there's a lot of different aspects of thinking, and I think that very often people can be at various levels of introspection, and they may realize which parts are logical and kind of left brain, easy to describe, more public kinds of characteristics of thinking that you can share with other people. Others are more hidden, and I was on the road to try to get into that part of it a little bit more and see how that related to strategic thinking. The parts that are harder to describe, kind of more private, sometimes more difficult to describe even to yourself. So they may be very private, but they may be so private they exclude your consciousness and you're not really aware of how that works. And by that I mean, the kinds of things where you're standing in a shower and you have that eureka moment about something you've been working hard about, but while you were relaxing, suddenly your unconscious was able to come up with some innovative, helpful new ideas. So I want to go down the road a little bit further this time towards those intangibles and discuss them because I think they're very interesting. I think that it's helpful to discuss how these things work and how they work for different people and how they relate to strategic thinking, which may be a little bit harder to describe. And so let me start out by pointing out that the very first slide that I have here, I have a quote from Robert S. McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense during a major part of the Vietnam era. He says in the very highly rated, excellent documentary film, The Fog of War, he has a number of rules that he sets out as he goes through the history of his interaction with the Vietnamese and with the government, our government, and later their government. And he says, rationality will not save us. And this is a very, very interesting film because he lays out all the ways in which the strategic thinking of the United States government fell down, did not really consider all the different factors of a cultural nature, historical nature, sociological, psychological nature. We had a very firm, intelligent grasp of the wrong assumptions, and they led us astray. And he basically says in there, and there's one point where he just says, we were wrong. And I think that studying these kinds of experiences can be very helpful. So I want to go from what I had discussed last time, which had to do with some things I thought that I could describe very well in terms of how we think and how they might relate to strategic thinking and how they were not strategic thinking, into this realm where rationality will not save us. But if rationality won't save us, then what is it that will save us? And I think that's really the crux of the issue here. So let me go on to the next slide. So I'm assuming that we're in a mature state of education and experience, all those that are privy to this discussion, and that we've already gone through this. And I decided that my first official slide of this section should simply be the acknowledgement that active learning is struggle, that you have to struggle to understand things. It's not easy. It's not just a simple path. There are some things that are simple to describe, But I think that Socrates had it right, and basically where he says he can't teach anybody anything, he can only make them think. And I think that I'm juxtaposing that quote with what's called the Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is very famous in education, where you describe different levels going from what might be thought of as a little bit more passive kinds of learning, where you get deeper and deeper engagement with the material and go through various steps, where it becomes more complicated and you're dealing with different dimensionalities of applying the data. So if we go up the pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy for thinking, we start out, we have knowledge, of course, and that's very important to have the raw material. And we go through that, learn the basic facts and details and techniques and things of that sort, with homework and tasks and projects and that sort of thing. And then we try to understand through our interaction with that material how we can apply it. And an important part of thinking is critical thinking, where we learn to analyze things. And then as we got further up there and become more mature thinkers, we can take all these things that we've pulled apart and analyzed and seen the different aspects of whatever it is that we're dealing with, and we start to put them together in different ways. And then finally, our judgment and our wisdom comes to the fore. And then having done all of these, we're up near the top of the Bloom's taxonomy, up at the top of this pyramid, where we can actually judge and we can see what's important, what's not important, which is really important for us to remember. I have been in many meetings where it's been really clear that sometimes to some people, certain facts just jump out and they have an epiphany and they see immediately what's really important, and then other people don't see it. They're overwhelmed by the complexity of the material, and they haven't got this intuition, this judgment, this perspective that you need to have at the very top of that pyramid in order to use the material most effectively and think strategically or even think tactically. Because if you want to be thinking the most efficiently, you need to have gone all the way up this pyramid. As I say, I'm assuming that we've all done this in various fields and that we're all familiar with this aspect of it. So part of this struggle, what I call this struggle, is not just struggling with the logical aspects of the material and the conceptual, cognitive aspects of this material. But I say that the struggle is also with your own conscious mind and your unconscious mind. That as we master a subject, we're also learning to master our own minds. That's something that we're doing at a very early age in school. It's very important that children at a very young age start to become actively engaged and have the ability to plumb the depths of their own minds and learn how it works. And it's very hard to teach, I would say. And there's different ways that people teach this. Certainly, assigning problems to be solved is one way to do it. Very easy. You have a chapter where you cover certain subjects. At the end of the chapter, there are exercises that are assigned to the students, and they learn to struggle with them. And very often they'll get wrapped around the axle because they'll just be too complicated. When I had the discussion at my last webinar, I described how I taught physics in Okinawa, and I basically said, here are a number of steps which I found helpful, and I recommend them, where you take the word problem, that's often what's presented at the end of chapters, and then you transform them into equations and symbols and some kind of graphical picture format where you can grasp it and transform it in different ways and manipulate the equations and the symbols. And if you try to hold the whole problem in your head, very often that can be very confusing, and that's sometimes a mistake, to try to think through what the solution is from the beginning without going through these mechanical steps. So people have to learn how their minds work and what gets them confused and how they can dig themselves out of a hole of confusion. And that's really, really important. So let's assume that we've all gone through this. We have some idea of how our minds work, but there may be still more to learn about that. So last time I wanted to humbly skirt the issue about what exactly is strategic thinking as opposed to other kinds of thinking. And I thought a good way to launch into this, once we've acknowledge that now we're going to think a little bit more or discuss a little bit more courageously what strategic thinking is, because it is hard to define. I thought I'd go out on the internet and just see what some folks that are consultants and experts, coaches in strategic thinking might have to say about it. So here's one that I thought was worth sharing, and I'll come back to what I had presented last time also. So major characteristics of strategic thinkers are described here. I'm not going to read all of these, but you'll recognize some of the characteristics as being very reasonable and probably motherhood and apple pie. How can you not say? You've got to be passionate about what you're doing, fully committed. You've got to be going outside of your comfort zone and constantly learning new things, and you need to differentiate between what it is you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it, and think at multiple levels. Don't be constrained to one particular level of thinking, and be looking at the meta problem. How your particular challenge is embedded in a higher schema of problems. So being risk takers is important. Being tenacious, being able to think big, think outside the box. These are pretty standard and hard to argue with, okay? The thinking outside the box, thinking big, there's an old saying that I'm paraphrasing slightly here, that no great thing is ever accomplished by a reasonable person, that you have to be challenging the limitations and going outside your comfort zone, of course. And you might say this is true of many different aspects of thinking. Let me go on to another one. Another view, and I put down the link at the bottom here. Some of these things we discussed last time. So a strategic thinker has to be very systems oriented, and they have to think very holistically, creative, innovative. They have to think in time, very important. So whatever bounds there are on tactical thinking in terms of wanting to accomplish operationally some specific near-term goal, we have to relax those constraints and think in larger systems with larger systems of measures of effectiveness and in larger framework of time, past and future, putting things in context. The strategic thinker is always looking around for other points of view, has a worldly mindset. Again, I don't want to go through reading all of these, but dealing with an entrepreneurial spirit, I think, is very interesting. A definition of an entrepreneur that I saw a long time ago that I like is someone who has a vision and has the capability of communicating that vision to others so that they'll help to make it a reality. And so they need to be charismatic, have good communication, be able to see how to get others to buy into the vision. And so I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. So now come back to something that I had discussed last time, which is what Wikipedia says. Always a good place to look, even though there are many caveats about Wikipedia. So major aspects are that they have a systems perspective, they're focused on where they're going, that they're committed to that. And so I think having a strong will, I think personality comes into this. This is not just a dry, antiseptic perspective. It's a committed perspective. They think in time, of course, which we mentioned before, and they can hold past, present, future in the mind at the same time. They're both creative and critical thinkers. So there's a danger in being too much of a critical thinker or thinking critically when you should be thinking creatively. And I think this is part of that dichotomy that is important to keep in mind, that you need to have the flexibility of consciousness so that you're approaching the problem from multiple directions, not only from multiple directions in terms of the content of the problem, but also multiple directions from the perspective of how your mind is wrestling with the problem, the conscious and the unconscious parts, the so-called left brain and right brain aspects of it. So that you have the capability of not being stuck in one or the other. The creative part, along with the will, has the ability to what I like to call the Alexander the Great principle. It's very famous, I think, of cutting the Gordian knot so that you're not stuck with a particular answer that seems to stop your progress forward. You have the ability to cut the Gordian knot with a creative solution or just pulling out your sword by using, basically exercising your will, saying, we're not going to be stopped by this, even though the logic of it may appear to say that there's no way forward and, you know, all is lost, it's hopeless. Whatever it may be, it's an insoluble problem. You simply use the powers that you have, not just of thinking creatively or thinking critically, but also of exercising your will to say, I'm going outside the bounds of this problem so that I can move forward. And I think that there are many, many cases of that where, you know, it seems that all is lost. Things are hopeless. You get tied in a logical knot, and being able to cut your way out of that logical knot is just extremely important, I believe. So cutting the Gordian knot is one example of that aspect of this. Being responsive and agile is clearly very important, not being locked into one particular way of looking at the problem or one particular plan. So as famously said down at the bottom of the slide, strategic thinking is really about thinking from multiple directions. There's an approach to thinking also, which I like to call the yin-yang thinking or the Taoist Tai Chi thinking, which Hegel made famous, which I had mentioned last time, as stages of thinking. Which is thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, where you have an idea, then you have the counterpoint to that idea, and then you synthesize them together. You look at something, you look at the opposite. This is, I think, very important. I discussed this a little bit in the past with the limitation of Aristotelian logic, where Aristotle is famously known for the principle of the excluded middle, that a thing is either true or not true. There's no middle ground. And that, in some ways, has held back Western culture from fully appreciating the fact that all things are the integration of opposites, and the Taoist perspective expresses that very well in terms of this Tai Chi symbol, which I show on this slide, that there's always two aspects to things, and it's important to seek the integration of those opposites. So, you know, one thing that, well, an example, in fact, that I used earlier this week and that I've used before is that in military thinking, systems thinking, it's often bemoaned the fact that there's too much stovepiping of projects, and the virtues of horizontal integration are often expressed, that it'd be good to hook up all the different satellites and sensors and all the different systems so that they can cooperate and collaborate and share information, and that this is a really good thing to have what's sometimes called horizontal integration. And I've always had a problem with that perspective because I like to think of the opposite of that, which is the stovepiping, as having its own benefits. And you shouldn't think about, I've said it before many times, in fact, don't tell me the virtues of horizontal integration unless you also tell me some of the virtues of stovepiping, how concentration and focus and compartmentalization can make for more efficiency and basically a more survivable, a more robust system sometimes by having things in separate compartments. So this is one of those instances of what I call the yin-yang principle or Tai Chi thinking, that wisdom consists of the integration of opposites. And I think that's very, very important. So these things are actually expressed. Some of these major attributes are expressed in this article in Wikipedia, which I highly recommend. I like thinking in terms of these different dimensions, and becoming comfortable with this type of thinking, I think, is very important. And it may seem difficult sometimes to justify your conclusions to other people because it seems to be paradoxical, even to yourself. And it's been expressed in this venue, as a matter of fact. You know, what do you do when you know what's right, but you basically cannot express it logically? That's a good question. And so this brings us back to this idea of personality as being very central to a great strategic thinker. It takes a great deal of self-confidence and understanding of how their mind works, and confidence in their own intuitions, not being led astray by their intuitions and by their unconscious mind. I think that's a very important aspect of this. So part of this that I think is very important is, that I've mentioned, is the will, intention, and self-interest. And so again, we're not thinking in terms of a very sterile way of thinking, something that can always be proven. But people make decisions, and then they have to stand by those decisions or change those decisions. And they need to be motivated by their own value system and their recognition of what's important. And so not having the ability, basically, to take a stand one way or the other can be a detriment to moving forward. Again, I'd like to distinguish this from the idea of an academic perspective, which tries to look at all sides equally, which is an important aspect of thinking, certainly. But when you're thinking strategically, when you're thinking from an operational point of view, what it is that we should do, you can't be totally bound by this idea of what's logical or what can you explain to other people. You need to have a vision. You need to be able to impart that vision, and you need to have the will to make a commitment. Otherwise, you have the danger of falling into what's sometimes called an analysis paralysis. So let me just tell you that a long time ago, I saw a video of a speech that Steve Jobs made back in the 1980s, which made me, gave me pause, made me think carefully about what he had said. Steve Jobs quoted Picasso. He said that Picasso said that mediocre artists borrow, great artists steal. And I thought that's a very interesting thing for him to say. And what's his point, and what did Picasso mean by that? And I had to think about that. And what it meant was that a great artist has the capability of seeing something that is new and takes it and makes it part of themselves. They own that thing. If you truly steal something, then the implication is it's yours. You put the impress of your personality, and you use it in ways that may never have been thought of before, and it becomes part of you. If you simply borrow something, you borrow a good idea. You're not necessarily, you don't have that proprietary feeling about it. You may feel stuck in the way that it was first envisioned and using it the way that the original artist or person had been using it. But if you truly steal it, if you truly make it your own, then you'll come up with different ways of using it. You'll come up with your own personality and your own style impressed upon that as part of whatever it is that you're constructing. And I think that a strategic thinker has that ability, that they're not borrowing things. They are the master of whatever it is that they're using, and they've made it part of themselves. Part of that is that they can weave that into a vision that is charismatic, that is compelling, that is emotionally charged, that they can help to impart to others who can help them to realize that vision, as I was saying before, that definition of the entrepreneur that I had mentioned. So in the Bible, the Old Testament, it says somewhere that without vision, the people perish. And that's a very interesting statement to me, again, that if you don't really have an underlying vision of where you're going and what's important and what it is that you're passionate about, then you're in trouble. And this vision is part of something that you do as a human being, that you create, that you buy into, that you expand. So I ask the question, are tactics to goals as strategy is to vision? In other words, if you're trying to accomplish some goal that's been assigned to you, then you're going to come up with some tactics to realize that. You're going to come up with some operational choices, decisions that help you to accomplish some goal, something that basically is perhaps short-term, perhaps limited in its extent, perhaps limited to one part of a subsystem of the great world or whatever it is that you're dealing with. Whereas strategy is to accomplish some vision, some value system that is very important to the strategist, to the strategic thinker. And then finally, I want to ask the question, will your conscious mind play well with your unconscious mind? If you're a person who is able to impress their will, impress their strategic thinking in a given area, then I would suggest that we consider seriously the interplay between your conscious and your unconscious mind. You need to have tremendous confidence in your unconscious mind. You need to know how to program your own unconscious mind and know when it is that it is feeding you fears and egotistical speculations and all sorts of other things that people's minds can play tricks on them, ways that they can play tricks, or whether it's helping you to develop a vision as to what's really important and what's really going on. And just parenthetically, let me mention that just yesterday I was watching a Netflix video on Churchill, and when Churchill started, at the very beginning, when he was given the leadership of Great Britain, he wrote in his diary that, knowing that they were in a terrible situation, just terrible situation. And he said that he had the feeling that he was walking with destiny. He had a vision of what it was that he was doing. He had taken whatever it was that his circumstances were that were just terribly, terribly tragic, and the odds were definitely stacked against him. And he managed to take all that, formulate in his mind a perspective that this was his destiny. This is what he had been preparing for his entire life, including many failures, many rejections from public life, many frustrations, and that this was something that he had been made for. He was walking with destiny. In fact, I think Walking with Destiny was in fact the title of that documentary that I was watching. So a strategic thinker may need some of that. I think that that's an important thing to consider. Understanding your role, your personal role, the role of your will in formulating that vision and then coming up with ways to realize that vision. I suggest it's worthy to discuss and think about how that plays along with your conscious and unconscious mind with actually accomplishing strategic thinking. Again, I almost want to apologize for an almost poetic perspective of this, but I think that this is the kind of thinking that could be helpful, and getting some discussion going might be helpful. So let me go back to a slide that I had shown last time, just to kind of get us to juxtapose this with the other things that we're talking about that I've alluded to. So there's types of thinking: left brain, vice right brain thinking. And then there's microscopic analysis into black boxes and what's inside of those black boxes, vice meta or macro synthesis of a system architecture. Being able to flip back and forth among these different types of thinking, I think, is crucial to a deep critical thinker who's also creative and can think strategically. Conscious thinking vice unconscious thinking. We all do that. And I mentioned last time, and I'll mention again here, there's a very interesting book by Nobel Prize winning psychologist named Kahneman. He has a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And the fast part is the unconscious mind, and the slow part is the conscious mind. And he basically says that, the conscious mind, the left brain, the part that is more public, that is easier to express to others, is the part that thinks it's in control, the part that I'm conscious of right now, of my mind, and that you're conscious of with your mind. You think that's who you are, that you think that that's basically making your decisions. But actually, it's your unconscious mind that is what Kahneman calls the secret author of all of your thoughts and actions. There's logical, vice intuitive. There's the monkey mind, vice mindful. And this is terminology from meditation books. Monkey mind is your mind's jumping all over the place, and then mindful is very helpful. That basically doesn't buy into that monkey mind, is not seduced away from whatever it is you're doing, and takes judgment out of what you're doing. The monkey mind is chattering and upset and, basically seduced away from whatever it is that you're trying to do, 1 second to the next, with other thoughts that come up that that you're not basically skillful in avoiding being pulled away. Whereas when you're being mindful, when you've learned to really focus, you can do that in a way that actually empowers your mind much more. So there's organized, compulsive, focused, and controlled types of thinking versus daydreaming, relaxed. Archimedes taking the bath, jumping out, when he has the idea, solves the problem. The eureka moment, fuzzy thinking, that type of thing. And then there's dialectic, yin-yang, synthesis, etc. Vice, A or not A, which is the Aristotelian law of the excluded middle. So again, I've said it before, all wisdom is the integration of opposites, and I would highly recommend becoming more familiar with the Taoist philosophy. So Goethe said something which I paraphrase slightly here, which is the mind is a wonderful servant but a terrible master. And part of this is to think of yourself as not just your mind, and understanding that parts of it that are harder to justify, harder to perhaps explain to other people, your will, your intuition, your vision, etc., is closer to where you really are in your full conscious plus unconscious mind. Whereas Goethe here is thinking about rational, conscious thinking. So the unconscious mind dominates. So I just mentioned Kahneman's book. Very interesting. Kahneman is a psychologist, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics for the work that he did. And this is just a brief quote of something that I've alluded to already. The picture that emerges from the recent research, the intuitive System 1, which is how he describes the unconscious mind, is more influential than your experience tells you, and is the secret author of many of the choices and judgments you make. Most of this book is about the workings of System 1, the unconscious mind, and the mutual influences between it and System 2, the conscious mind. I highly recommend this book. I think it's just extremely, extremely interesting, and gives us a lot of insight as to how we're really thinking, something that is often very hidden, that we may feel shy about describing because we're afraid of being judged, because it really doesn't seem very logical, does not often seem often may not seem very adult. And it's important to get on good terms with your unconscious, I think. Here's a nice quote from Freud, which I had given last time, but I think it's worth repeating. And I will read this. I apologize for that, but I just think it's very, very interesting. When making a decision of minor importance, I've always found it advantageous to consider all the pros and cons. In vital matters, however, the decision should come from the unconscious, from somewhere deep inside of you. Very interesting that Sigmund Freud said that. And that's basically the idea that the conscious mind can be easily confused, can't deal with really important things, may not necessarily know how to factor in all the subjective impressions. And the unconscious mind somehow can deal with these things. Very, very interesting. And I would suggest, again, that we consider whether strategic thinking has more of this aspect to it than tactical thinking, problem solving, solving some problems in physics, inventing something new, inventing a sewing machine, something of that sort, which is tremendously creative, tremendously challenging and important, but really is not strategic thinking, I would say. So coming back then to how we can make our thinking more efficient and better, and I'm changing the pace here a little bit. This might be a good time to ask if there's any questions, if there's any discussion of what I've said before, but I will be coming back to that shortly. But I just wanted to review here quickly some of these aids to thinking. There's systems thinking. This Edward de Bono is very famous for writing a lot of books and being very influential in the area of teaching people to think creatively. He's the one who invented the phrase lateral thinking. I have a copy of his book called Teaching Your Child How to Think. And this is one of the quotes from that book. Many of the tools of thinking are simply attention-directing tools. Simply attention-directing tools. The implication here is that when you direct your attention to something, your mind knows how it should deal with that in some sense. The I Ching is, the ancient Chinese book of changes. Something that, again, anecdotal, a story that I had read, actually, about a detective. This is fiction, but I thought it was very interesting. Used the I Ching when he got stuck, and he would take out the little bones, whatever they're called, with the various symbols, the yin-yang symbols from the I Ching book. And he would throw them, and it would make him think outside the box. It would make him think without being constrained by his logic, by his prejudices, by what it was that he thought was important initially, but would give him a new direction. So he would just toss the bones, read the interpretation, and it would force him to think about whatever it was, whatever detective-type problem he was trying to solve. It would force him to think in a different way. And I think that's a very interesting thing to do, to throw in some randomness sometimes. There's actually a similar kind of an issue in mathematical game theory, von Neumann-Morgenstern game theory, where sometimes the optimal solution is a mixed strategy, where you specifically, in order to foil your opponent, you actually put in some randomness into what it is you're going to do next. There's a concept of a mastermind, and Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, probably made that famous, probably almost 100 years ago now, at least 60 or 80 years ago. The idea being that getting people together to discuss things will help to come up with better ideas. The mastermind is a supportive group of people that discuss things in a way that their minds somehow acting together becomes more powerful, more creative, more intuitive, more useful than they would be otherwise. And there are many ways that this is used in group discussions in education. It's certainly very well known that getting people together to discuss problems can come up with solutions that no individual would have thought of. Journaling causes a shift in consciousness. There's a lot of aspects of this, which we'll discuss another time, which has to do with different levels of consciousness. When you're talking to other people, when you're talking to yourself, making speeches while you're driving in the car, when you're hiking, when you're in the shower, doodling, drawing pictures, whatever it might be. All these things help you to tap into your unconscious in different ways and can be useful. And making sure that you have these available to you can be very important. Journaling, for instance, I have read that many, many great people have been journalers. The quote that I gave you from, that I mentioned about Churchill earlier, was basically describing what he wrote in his diary. So he was in the habit of writing voluminously. He was always writing, and you find that a lot of people who accomplish a lot are inveterate journalers. And that's a very helpful thing, causes you to process the information and basically taps into your unconscious, validating your memories and your decisions and your experiences, and putting it in front of yourself, your conscious and your unconscious mind, in a way that you can digest it a little bit better, a little bit more extensively. There's a concept of optimal chunking, which is for very complicated problems, so you can sometimes break it apart into smaller problems. There's the concept of transforming to other spaces. And mathematicians know about Fourier analysis, that sometimes you can transform a problem into a different mathematical space where it becomes simple algebra to solve what was a very complex, difficult partial differential equation. in another expression of that problem. So there's a lot of ways that transforming a problem can help, not just something that's formalistically very mathematical, but just some of the things that I mentioned before, translating a word problem into symbols, equations, and diagrams. Learning how to see without interference of your unconscious mind. Again, I mentioned this last time, but I think it's really worth mentioning again. When I took a class in drawing a long time ago, one of the exercises was to draw a picture of a face, and they gave you a picture of a person's face, and you were asked to draw that picture of the face. And then, having done that, the instructor said, now turn that picture that you were using as the model, the one that they had given you, turn it upside down and now draw that. And without the interference of your unconscious mind with your own assumptions and prejudices as to the proportions of a face, you actually wound up drawing a much better picture of that face when it was upside down, because you couldn't see it in the same way. You had to actually look at where the lines were. I think that's a very, very interesting story, very, very interesting experience, and shows how sometimes your unconscious mind can really fool you. The prejudices you have may be wrong. The intuitions that you have may be wrong. And so knowing that there's this, positive, there's the pros and cons is very important. Another aspect is that we've learned from linguistics is having a vocabulary, a large vocabulary, is not just a sign of intelligence, but it also helps to promote intelligence. And I would suggest that it's not just a vocabulary of words, but also images and models and tools, lots of different types of ways of thinking. And, a strategic thinker or any good thinker is constantly adding to what I call the bag of tricks. So there's a quote from Thomas Edison. Edison said at one point that to be an inventor takes some imagination and a very large pile of junk. And so I think of a bag of tricks as being this pile of junk, something that you can put together in many different ways. And I don't think of them always as simply being very organized. I think of them as piled up in a large bag of tricks. And I try to increase my bag of tricks whenever possible. If I see a problem being solved in a way that I had never seen before, it really grabs my attention. And I think, here's another thing I can throw into my bag of tricks, another way of thinking about problems. And not being too organized about how I structure them in my mind, I think is important. I try to have them available so that I can randomly put them together and look at different ways of approaching a problem without being constrained by thinking, well, this kind of problem has to apply here, and that kind of a solution has to apply to this kind of a problem, that type of thing. And finally, I'm saying here that, you should trust your unconscious, but not too much. It can get you in trouble. And knowing how to deal with that is just very, very important. So coming back to this, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, I had mentioned that I wrote a response to a request for information back in 2012 about how to help people think better. And I wrote something, put this up on my blog. You can see this up on blog.rockower.com. What I thought was important were all of these different ways of thinking, and I put it in the form of a mind map, just try to organize all the different ways that people can help their thinking, the tools that they can use to apply to their thinking, the kinds of systems thinking that they may find useful, and some of the pitfalls to thinking, how people go astray. So I'll go through this relatively quickly because I think it's important to pay homage to some of these aspects. I mentioned this idea of transforming a problem, and one aspect of this model is to abstract things into other spaces, some of which might be more abstract, some of them might be more concrete spaces, coming at a problem from different directions, visualizing things in different ways, and applying different kinds of models to a problem that you're trying to solve. And there's a bunch of different things. And I just put down a whole bunch because it's useful to remember that there are many options when you're trying to solve a problem that you can use. Quantitative methods, qualitative methods, things that transform the problem, things that put different problems together to make perhaps a more easily solved problem. So there's a concept of embedding, where if you sometimes take a problem and make it seemingly more complicated, take a two-dimensional problem, put it into 3 dimensions, it may then become trivially solvable. And so there's a lot of different transformations that you can make. And this is just to remind us of that. There's many different tools that you can use, that you can apply, tools and methods that you can apply to different kinds of problems. You may need to quantify some judgmental data, and there are techniques for doing that. You may need to learn to see the problem better using whole brain thinking and yin-yang analysis. The thing I mentioned about turning a face upside down allows you to see the problem from different perspectives. De Bono's 6 hats, which is a technique where you have people wearing a different hat that basically has a different role. So you're supposed to only think creatively if you wear a certain hat. You're only supposed to think critically if you wear a different kind of a hat. And maybe another one is more operationally, and maybe another one is more organizationally. I forget exactly what they are. But the idea is that it's directing your attention to thinking in certain ways. The let the problem solve itself alludes to what I mentioned last time about teaching physics in Okinawa, where you follow certain steps of a process, and at each step it becomes more clear as to what you're supposed to do in the next step. So you don't try to hold the whole problem in your head, basically, the invariant embedding I had mentioned before. Brainstorming is very important to come up with new ideas. There's an interesting saying, which is, don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. So when you're brainstorming, make sure it comes to a conclusion. Otherwise, that can get very open-ended and go on forever. Systems thinking I mentioned. There are a lot of very important techniques that help you to focus on the system that you're dealing with, what's inside the system and what's outside the system, what's the meta system, what are the decision variables. Influence diagrams are very useful. Again, I'm not going to go through any of these in detail, but just the point that a mature thinker needs to have access to a lot of different ways of thinking. And sometimes they're microscopic, and sometimes they're looking at it from a very large scale systems point of view, from many different perspectives, possibly from many different stakeholders' points of view. And then finally, this is important that everybody be aware of the different traps and errors that are the pitfalls of thinking. Number one is there's sometimes a tendency to premature closure. You know, there's a feeling of insecurity when you're not really sure that you're understanding a problem correctly or that you're not approaching it correctly. And if you basically say, oh, this fits into this cubbyhole, or this is the way I should attack this problem, or this is, how we should define ultimately what this problem is, this can be an issue. So you have to avoid premature closure, and yet obviously you must make some decisions as you approach the problem. I mentioned trying to hold the entire problem in your head at one time can be a trap. That's really a trap that I can give you a very personal, interesting story that I think makes a good point in 2 ways. Number one is, why this can be a problem and why trying to prove how smart you are can be a problem. These are related. So when I was an undergraduate, I took a course in symbolic logic. And I thought, I love math and physics. This is going to be great. I'm going to love symbolic logic. And in the course, I found that I could solve the problems in my head initially. And I remember feeling proud of myself that I could solve these problems in my head. I could do it without doing the symbol manipulation that we were being taught in the class. And I was totally distracted by this really egotistical red herring of solving problems in my head, because at a certain point, about, I don't know, maybe a third of the way through the course, maybe halfway through the course, suddenly the problems were too big. I could not hold them in my head any longer. I couldn't solve the problems in my head. And that's when I had my epiphany. Ed, you are an idiot. This course is not about proving how smart you are, and it's certainly not about trying to solve these problems in your head. It's learning these mechanical techniques for manipulating symbols in order to solve extremely difficult problems. And I had fallen behind in learning, mastering those things, and I had to play catch up. And it was a real epiphany to me, as I say. It was like, oh, this was, really a big mistake on my part. Two mistakes. One is trying to hold the whole problem in my head, thinking that that was really important when it was not the point of the course at all. And thinking that I was proving how smart I was when I was really just showing how naive I was and what bad judgment I had. And that was a lesson that was very important for me to learn, I think. So other aspects, pitfalls of thinking, is hiding your ignorance. And anyway, excessive brainstorming here again. And the other thing is, another one is staying within your comfort zone. Basically, one big pitfall of thinking I'm going to come to in a second is this idea of, staying within your comfort zone when you're trying to solve a problem, using a technique that you're very, very comfortable with, rather than some other technique which might be much more appropriate and helpful that you have less confidence in. So here's a little summary of some of the things I just mentioned. And I'll describe this drunk looking for the keys under a streetlight as very much an example of staying in your comfort zone. So another one is lack of systems thinking, lack of yin-yang thinking. These are pitfalls. And not being able to see the forest for the trees. In other words, sometimes a pitfall of thinking is being overwhelmed by all the details. And I like to think of this idea of not being able to see the forest for the trees as an instance where you need to learn to squint. Sometimes if you squint at a picture or at a scene, you can see things that didn't jump out at you. You can see the larger patterns that are there. So I would say that in order to see the forest and not be distracted by the excessive complexity of, hundreds of trees, you need to squint in order to do that. And there's another book that I'd like to recommend. It's very interesting. There's a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink. And in there, he describes work that's been done on what's called thin slicing, the ability to find patterns in events from very thin slices or narrow windows of experience, where the person themselves can't really describe how it is that they know what's going on. They've managed to harness their unconscious mind for very, very quick pattern recognition. And based on what seems to be very thin slices of information, they're able to see what's really going on. And so this concept of thin slicing is a way which your unconscious mind may be giving you the correct answer, or it may be giving you an incorrect answer. And you don't really know without some critical thinking on top of that. But this is an important part of it. The thin slicing is a way of harnessing this, what Kahneman calls System 1, the unconscious mind, where you're basically not being overwhelmed by all the information. You're able to see what's important intuitively and very, very quickly. But anyway, this is a very interesting book, and something that I would say that a good strategic thinker is very good at this thin slicing. Must be, because you're dealing with complexity at the highest level of complexity. You're dealing with very large systems. You're dealing with visions which may be difficult to impart. And yet seeing what's important and recognizing what needs to be done, even though it may be difficult to describe that or justify that. So the drunk searching for his keys is a classic story which everyone should know. It has to do with getting out of your comfort zone. Just don't just use the tools that you're most comfortable with to solve the problems. So the story is that there's a drunk who's searching for his car keys under a streetlight, and a good Samaritan comes along, wants to help, and basically says, what are you doing? Can I help you? And the drunk says, yeah, I've lost my keys under this light. So the good Samaritan comes, says, I'll help you. And after they've been searching for a little while, he says to the drunk, are you sure you lost them here? Because I sure don't see them here. And the drunk says, no, I lost them in that dark alley over there, but the light's better here. And that's the classic story of the drunk searching for the keys within his comfort zone, in essence, within his comfort zone, and not being willing to get out of that. Anyway, the relying on your intuition may be one of those. Relying on your rational mind may be one of those comfort zones, even though the rational mind may be not necessarily the most efficient way of accessing the problem or accessing the details of the problem. Okay. So now I'm coming back, I'm circling back into the theme that I think is worthy of some discussion, which is this notional thinking system. Who's in charge here? This is the thing that I think would be interesting to discuss as to which parts of your mind are more important for strategic thinking, or which integration of these different aspects of your mind are more important. The conscious mind, according to Kahneman, is actually the slower mind, not nearly as fast a thinker, can't deal with the overwhelming complexities of things. The unconscious mind, which is closely tied to the emotions, the physical body, touch and sound and sight, is a part of our mind that we have less control over. And is there some useful discussion that we can have about training people to be more comfortable in dealing with the visions and the intuitions and the thin slicing that we all use to some extent, that we're all subject to, but that are harder to describe? And here I've mentioned this in the context of sensors and human intel networks and computer analyses and things of that sort that are fed data and can interact with our conscious mind. And then there's perceptions which relate to our unconscious mind that influence our conscious mind. And is this a reasonable notional system of how we think? And how can we program our unconscious mind to give us more reliable intuitions and more reliable visions? And what kind of personalities are perhaps more comfortable with thinking in these kinds of terms? And so this is the kind of discussion I think would be useful from lots of different people with different experiences in different areas, to see whether there's some useful wisdom that we can extract from such a discussion. So at some point I'd like to come back to this. Maybe now's a good time to ask if there's any rebuttal or comments or agreement or disagreement with the things I've been saying here. Before I kind of go on a little bit further, let me come back here and ask whether folks think that this is a helpful discussion. Tim, could you kind of pulse the participants here?
Yes, sir, I will. Okay, let's start with, we have a couple of people on phones. I'll get back to them in a moment. Bill Campbell, do you have any comments or questions at this point, sir? And thanks for being here.
I'm not sure if this is working.
It is?
Well, no, I think it's a very, it's an interesting discussion. I think that Dr. Rockower is presenting some potentially useful tools, I guess you might say, for thinking about those sort of things. I dropped something into the chat box there, which I mean, it's not something I'm particularly perturbed about. I think that it was something to do with, there was a quotation that he offered: "No great thing is ever accomplished by a reasonable person." And perhaps we have different definitions of what reasonable means. To me, reasonable does not necessarily exclude creative thought or risk-taking or a lot of things that sometimes get lumped in with that. To me, reasonableness is simply adopting beliefs according to observable reality as opposed to trying to adjust unreasonable thought being the opposite, adjusting our interpretations of reality to comport well with our current beliefs. So that's all I got to offer at this point, I think.
Thanks, Bill. Doctor, comment?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Of course, that's kind of a, saying something in an extreme sense in order to make a point that it takes sometimes a leap of faith that you have to go outside of what can be proven. But yeah, I understand your point of view, and I certainly don't disagree with it. The quote is not, it's not my quote. It's just expressing this idea that you can't always prove what it is that your decisions are, that you sometimes have to rely on your intuition. So yeah, I accept that as a reasonable criticism of that quote. But as I say, it's kind of trying to make a point of thinking outside of what you can always prove. Thank you.
Very good. Let's go with Greg Gittens. Greg, you have a comment or question at this point, please? There's a little reverb from your end, Greg. Are you on two different lines with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I think you have. Are you on a phone line and the computer?
I might be. Let me see if I can make an adjustment and get back with you.
Okay, we'll go on then. John Drury. Comment, question? John? Okay, let's go with Justin. Justin, glad you're here. Appreciate it. Any questions or comments?
Yes, sir, I do. I just had a question. If you could go back to your, Dr. Rockower, first of all, thank you for this discussion. If you could go back to your pyramid slide real quick, I had a question for you on that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Very close to the beginning, I think. Yeah.
So going back to what you were saying about sort of looking at things in different ways, I had a question. So you start with, and forgive me, I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to ask here, but you start with knowledge at the bottom. And if in a process, say if you're trying to figure out a business model, for example, wouldn't it make more sense to start at the top, or flip it around and start at the evaluation of a previous model and then work your way backwards, if that makes any sense whatsoever. But I'm just trying to think.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I see what you're saying. This is not a pyramid of how you would operationally approach a problem in a real scenario. This is a model of education. Bloom's taxonomy has to do with the stages, the levels of mastery of material for people that are learning. And so the very beginning has to start with knowledge. You need some foundation, some facts that you can recall, that you've got memorized, that you know where to look things up and things of that nature. And so that's what this Bloom's taxonomy is all about. It's very famous, I guess, in the area of education. And when you design a course and you come up with your syllabus and your textbook and with the various modules and things of that sort, they should be going progressively up this pyramid. So I understand what you're saying, but this does not apply in that context. This doesn't apply in, how should you approach a new problem or anything of that. This assumes you start from ignorance or some minimal background of a subject, and you want to learn and become more and more a master of that material and be able to use it in useful ways. So I think that's what the interpretation is that should be here.
Okay. Let's go on with Admiral Peter Kakarios. Admiral?
Yes, Steve, thank you. Good morning, and I would like to thank very much our presenter today. Today he gave, something that you need many years to study on, but he's a master on the things, and I would say from my experience, because I've been through this process of strategic thinking since I was a very young officer, and I think that one thing that I would like to point is that not all minds are the same, and there are some very strong minds since the beginning which are built to think much better and more strategically and give solutions. And from my expertise, I could say that, for example, the Naval Academy, I could, had a photographic memory, and I could remember everything. This is what my mind helped me. And going ahead, then I was a life student and learning and thinking and every day. But this helped me to create the background, as our presenter said, of knowledge. And after you create the background of knowledge, then you are able to see a little bit further, and not only to, I mean, sit on your intuition, but you have to use both, and one helps the other. And you go ahead and you find that you can vision things that the other cannot understand, and you can cut them in pieces, and then to go ahead and make them happen. And I liked very much what he said about Alexander the Great, that with the Korean then was that you have to have the will to go ahead, and you have to have a strong mind, a vision, and the will. And I would like to thank you very, very, very much.
Okay, thank you, Admiral. I'm not sure I caught all of it. It was not quite loud enough. The idea that you had expressed that people's minds are very different, I totally agree with that. Certainly, there's a wide variation in people's approach to thinking and their expression of will, and that that is definitely something to agree with. Thank you for your comments.
Okay, let's go with Rob Worthington. Rob, do you have a question or comment?
No questions.
Thank you. And go back to John. Let's see if John's, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Question or comment, sir?
I had some audio difficulties. Yes, Dr. Rockower, first of all, my head swimming in thoughts. Easy analogy. I feel like I've just jumped into a wet pool on a hot day. So thanks for the presentation. I want to quote something from Mark Lowenthal that wrote a foreword for David Moore's Intelligence Critical Thinking. And basically he said that analysis, the focus on analysis, quote, has been spent on techniques, presentation, and outcomes. Much less has been spent on what happens intellectually while you are thinking. That indeed is what critical thinking is about, the ability to step out of one's thoughts, if you will, to examine them in the process that brought them about even while you are thinking them. It does not require some higher level of cosmic consciousness or a split personality. It does require training and thought. So now we are thinking about our thinking while we're thinking, a mental triple play, if you will. I think about your graph about the unconscious, and if you had to describe, or if I had to describe, not with no authority, what I think my brain is made up of, there's the unconscious, and there's the emotional, and then there's the conscious, which is the left and right brain. That's just my interpretation. And the unconscious I see as kind of the boss a lot of times, and it plays with me in my thinking. In other words, I will consciously want to get something figured out in a certain amount of time, but my unconscious basically tells me that it's in charge and it will figure that out in due course, and kind of, you know, then you wake up one day and you go, you know, I have paintings that sit there and I don't finish for a long time, and I look at it and I haven't touched it for a long time. I go, it's finished. That's why. So I guess what I'm saying is could you comment on the the difficulty, who's the boss, the conscious or the unconscious, and how do you manage that? In the real world, we have to manage our conscious, but when we're doing critical thinking, a lot of times we have to let the unconscious be the boss. That's my question.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. That actually is kind of what I'm trying to come around to. Really, the main point of discussion is, what is it that a person can do in terms of making decisions as to how to get into a better relation with their unconscious, accept what its limitations and powers are. I think that's a very big part of developing wisdom and mastery of your mind, and of being able to solve very difficult problems and think strategically. And so my answer would be to recognize that there's different channels of communicating with your unconscious, that we all have to take responsibility for programming our unconscious minds so that they work on the problems that we want them to work on, that they don't get distracted by, childhood fears and unconscious ambitions or wrong impressions about things. And that as part of that programming of our unconscious and learning to deal more effectively and efficiently with it is that we should all be journalers. We should all journal. I think that's just extremely important because, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, people had these extensive correspondences with other bright minds in the world. And the act of writing put them in a mental communication with those other people and expressed their unconscious desires to basically express their ideas coherently for the others to understand. And so when they were writing these letters, when they were, doing these extensive correspondences, or even when they were doing journaling, they were basically tapping into a different part of their consciousness. They were having a shift in consciousness that was very beneficial. And now when we write emails, there's some of that. And I'm very conscious of how my feeling of the state of consciousness changes if I'm writing something, if I'm talking to somebody, if I'm driving along making speeches in my head, which I do quite a bit. When I'm thinking, I think in terms of making speeches. And I've done that for a very long time. I think since I was in junior high school, I thought in terms of other people listening to what I have to say, and we're trying to figure this out together. And so being conscious of how you interact with your unconscious mind is very important. Journaling can help you to do that. Being very conscious of how you write is important. Being conscious of how you think in terms of dialogues with other people. Interesting comment, by the way, is a friend of mine who is a produce broker, had at one point been a screenwriter in Hollywood. And he told me one time that he thought in terms of dialogue. He thought in terms of characters talking to each other. And I kind of laughed because I think in terms of making speeches. and I think it'd be interesting for everybody to think in terms of, how do you think? When you're driving along, or if you're, musing about something while you're taking a shower, what is your experience? Think about that. Try to become conscious of that. Another instance of this shift in consciousness, by the way, which is different. This is going to be different for different people. Is I'm somewhat ambidextrous, and I throw with my left hand. I kick a football with my left foot. I play tennis right-handed. I shoot a rifle right-handed. I shoot a bow and arrow left-handed. And so I know that I'm wired up a little differently than other people in how I perceive time. By creating PowerPoint slides of schedules, I realized a long time ago when I was in my early 30s, in fact, that I see the past as being on the right side and the progression towards the future going towards the left side. So as I visualize the months, I see January to my right, I see August on my left. Now, knowing that was very confusing initially, But after a while, I realized that how you visualize things is an important part of how you're thinking. And I would suggest that people think about how they visualize past, present, future, how they visualize their relationship with the role that they're playing. And let me give you another example here, okay? This is maybe getting a little bit far afield, I don't know, but I think it's very interesting in terms of shifts in consciousness. When I developed public speaking, by teaching, I taught statistics in an MBA course when I was in my early 30s, and had to develop a way to think about getting in the frame of mind to get up in front of people and talk. And I developed something which was a leaning into it. And I actually feel when I'm starting to speak in front of other people that something rotates in my mind, and I'm bringing to the fore a different facet of my personality. My public speaking persona is what I think of it as. And I have a very kinesthetic feeling towards that, which I think is related to my left-handed ambidextrous propensities. Other people may have different ways of thinking of that. So the bottom line here is that I feel like, and I may be wrong about this is totally anecdotal evidence, totally subjective. I feel like I have various ways of communicating with my unconscious, of preparing myself to solve problems. And these different ways of thinking, I'm very conscious of them because I've been very introspective about how I think. I've been very interested in this, since a very, very early age. And whether this consciousness is useful in developing strategic thinking, I would not hazard a guess, okay? But I would say the ability to tap into different parts of your persona, different parts of your mind, has got to be helpful in general. And I would think that a person who's very confident in their relationship with their unconscious, who trusts their intuitions, who has strong feelings about being able to solve problems or seeing the problem as it really is, these are useful things, and that these different ways of shifting your consciousness and of being aware of your consciousness and your interaction with your unconscious has got to be a useful thing, I think. I mean, it could also, take you down a red herring. It might distract you from the real problem. You have to stay in touch with reality and see how it's actually helping you. When I have a difficult problem to solve, I have the subjective sensation that I'm leaning into the problem, and that by leaning into the problem, I'm basically communicating to my unconscious that I want my unconscious to be thinking about that and solving that problem, even while I go off and do different things. I have that feeling. Whether it's true, I don't know. Whether it's really helpful, I don't know, but it seems like it is. So anyway, I sorry for this long-winded answer to your question, but this is really the crux of the problem. Thank you for the question.
Yes, sir. Along those lines, I have very visual constructs myself for how I look at different problems. So I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Let's go to one other person, Doctor, and then we'll call it that. We'll have a different webinar later on to finish this out, if you don't mind. I think we're about at 11:20 right now, East or Central Time. So let's go with Greg Githens. Greg, can you hear me now? Do you have a question or comment, sir?
Yeah, thank you. So I will add a comment, which I just recently finished Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and I agree with Dr. Rockower. It's a very good book. I'm still presently at the point of trying to take all of the thoughts and all the notes that I made in the book and trying to bring it together specifically to say how does it affect strategic thinking, and what are some of the specific strategic thinking lessons that we have. I guess I would offer this as one of the things that I have learned through looking at the book, is that basically all of us, it's human nature to be a poor decision maker. I mean, we make a lot of good decisions, but occasionally we make some really bad, boneheaded decisions. Mm-hmm. And Kahneman wrote the book from the perspective of being an observer, watching other people make not so good decisions. And I would suggest that maybe one of the techniques that we should all think about is to have a strategic thinking partner, a person who can help us see mistakes that we are stumbling into as we go about doing it. And for me, that was one of the important lessons from that book. But I do think there are others. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's right. He does point out how bad we are at decision making and how we're generally overconfident. We're way too confident in our perceptions, and I totally agree with that. I have a theory that I call Swiss cheese consciousness. I came up with this a long time ago, that every individual has blind spots. Every individual has a consciousness that's a little bit like a slice of Swiss cheese. It has holes in it. And that the only way that you can really deal with that efficiently is you get a bunch of people together in what you might call a mastermind group or a strategy partner or whatever you might want to call it. And then their different Swiss cheese layers will overlap and fill in all those gaps. This is how I perceive this issue. The issue of the fact that, for various historical reasons, by growing up under different circumstances, having different, disappointments and traumatic experiences and gaps in our education and experience, whatever it might be, we all have blind spots. And so we do need other people. And doing that efficiently means having the full spectrum of people. And again, there's one other part of this which I think is important. I have had the experience of sitting around a table with very, very smart people trying to solve a problem, and I have realized that somebody's missing at the table, that you got a bunch of smart people knowing a lot of things about different things, having expertise, but, oh, wait, we need a Ph.D. statistician here who really understands certain things. We need somebody who's an expert in I don't know, some electromagnetic part of the spectrum that has to do with whatever it is we're dealing with. We have a bunch of smart people, and we're complementing each other with a C-O-M-P-L-E, not I. So we're thinking we can solve this problem, but we don't have all the right people at the table, and so we're going around in circles. I've seen that kind of thing happen, and I think it's important to have the right mix of people for any particular kind of discussion. Anyway, I agree. Thank you for the comment.
Dr. Admiral Picarius has one more question. We'll go there, then we'll close it out.
Yeah, Admiral, could you speak a little louder this time? Because I could barely hear you last time.
Can you hear me now better?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Well, one comment I would like to present here from my experience in the past is that, and this gives more weight on what you said before. I've been in different scenarios and cases where I won't
name persons, but I remember in different situations that they were kind of leaders who were responsible for a region, and they many times they thought that they knew everything better than anyone else. And they were making reports, which reports were going to much higher level, and wrong decisions were made, which were paid too much, and not only for not only regarding money, but also regarding our, external and foreign relations and strategy. And I think this goes where you said that you have to have many very well not only educated but very good but people that they know the situation and they can see and they can understand the minor indicators and what might come next. And so if you don't have a very, very, very good idea and education on the matter, no matter how good you are, you make mistakes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this also relates to the dangers of expertise, that sometimes And I have heard that studies have shown that sometimes the most expert people are the hardest to teach, because they really know so much about what it is that they know about, have so much good experience, and they're not aware of the gaps in their expertise.
Indeed. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say that Admiral Karius, by the way, is a good friend and advisor, and he's a retired Greek admiral living in Florida. A really great and knowledgeable person, too, by the way, in lots of different things. Admiral, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Having said that, Dr. Rockower, let's call it a day. It is now 11:27 a.m. Central Time. And we'll take this up and continue it at a future date. We do appreciate it. Everyone, thank you for being here.